if you want to know about the economy and how it's been damaged and, the troubles and the problems that lockdown's brought, you need to talk to somebody who's probably one of the most successful businessmen this country's ever produced. And that's Mr. John Caudwell, who is a business leader and philanthropist, I beg your pardon, but probably better known to you all as the founder of Phones for You. And I'm delighted to say that Mr. Caudwell is on the line with me now. Mr. Caudwell, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on, John. And look, I'll tell you something. It's not just because you're on the line, but I've said this to other people who come and talk to us. Tim Martin, the founder of Wetherspoon, okay? Richard Branson, of Virgin. Lord Sugar. I believe people like them and you should have a much, much greater impact on running the country because you know how to run things and you can put your business brains to the business of running Britain, which after all is one huge blinking business, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. It is a pure business, a complicated one, but all the same principles apply to running the UK as they would to running a moderate-sized business. It's just scale.
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same principles. What we have to do is create wealth, create efficiency, create productivity, and invest in it.
Yeah.
And, the point that I've been making continually under Caudwell Pandemic Recovery, which I call CPR, is that we need to invest now more than ever in the past. And the reason we can invest is very, very simple, because interest rates are very low, zero effectively.
Yes.
We also have almost no risk of inflation, so we can borrow the money with no risk of inflation and invest in the economy to create the future. And if we don't do that, we're in for a dire 10 years, not just a dire 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, but aren't we already smashed to pieces, John, on the economy? I mean, it's now so wrecked, I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. So if we're in debt of 320 billion quid already, I presume at modern day interest rates, the Chancellor just parks that, doesn't he, in a separate account and says we'll deal with that later, and they pay about 6 billion a year interest on it, which is peanuts.
Absolutely right, Mike. Yeah. I mean, there's two parts to this.
Yeah.
Part number one is we have to rescue the here and now, which is looking after businesses that are badly, badly devastated, as you so rightly say, as a consequence of this pandemic.
Yeah.
We have to look at after the individual. So we have to look after the entire population of Britain that are negatively affected by this pandemic, to look after the short term here and now.
Yeah.
But at the same time as doing that, we have to invest in the future, because the fallout, no matter what we do, the fallout is going to be devastating in terms of jobs. I've been predicting, initially I said 2 to 3 million. I've increased that to 3 to 4 million.
Right.
Initially I said, and I'm going back 9 months now, initially I said a GDP drop of maybe up to 15%. I'm thinking now that's more like 11 to 12%.
Right.
But whatever the numbers, it's devastating for the UK economy. So it's a combination of looking after the here and now whilst investing massively in the future. And if we do that, we're still in for a tough 2 or 3 years, but gradually the investment that we're making in the future will start to create real jobs and real GDP growth for the British economy.
Yeah, but I don't know if we'll ever get back. One of the things that most irritates me, John, is that the people making these decisions, which affect tens of millions of people's lives, the self-employed, the white van man, the guy who's got his own little business, the shop seller at Waterloo Station, the flower seller at Waterloo Station, their jobs may be gone forever because the people making the decisions are usually civil servants, very middle class, secure salaries, not losing anything. Even when you're getting 80% on furlough, they're still getting 100% of their salaries, which I think is very unfair. I think the wrong people are making the wrong decisions.
Yeah, I've got a sympathy with that view, Mike, but I wouldn't agree with it totally because, I've got a sympathy with your no lockdown view. I'm not a fan of lockdown. I think if you take the total damage done to the economy, to lives of young people who are not getting the right medical treatment because there's so much focus on corona.
Absolutely.
If you take all of that into account, I think the damage that we're doing to human lives is much greater than letting the virus spread and hopefully build herd immunity and hopefully get through it that way.
Yeah.
But you've got to realise, and I do realise, that the politicians are in a very delicate position, because if they don't seem to get some degree of control of the pandemic, and it does get out of control to the point that every intensive care bed is full, we then have people dying of suffering of terrible consequences that the health service can't cope with. So the government are in a terribly difficult position. I think more challenging than any government ever since the war. So it is a tough place, but I don't particularly agree with lockdown. I think we have to minimise lockdowns and minimise the effect on the economy and on people with other illnesses.
Yeah, go on.
To your point, what was your other point, Mike?
No, there wasn't a point. No, I was going to follow up from what you've just said by saying to you, I would expect you to show that empathy, for people's lives and the health and for the NHS, because of course you are a philanthropist these days. But nevertheless, John, you made your fortune and you richly deserve it for being a brilliant businessman. Now, somebody who is starting out a year ago may have got to your position had his business been allowed to thrive unencumbered by lockdowns. Those people now will never get the opportunity. So you must have a great deal of sympathy for budding entrepreneurs as well, whose lives have been crushed.
I have massive sympathy for those people, massive sympathy. And it's why on day one, I was lobbying the government. Day one by this, I'm talking about early March,
right,
when the government told me that they got 13 billion allocated to corona pandemic.
Yes.
And I absolutely was flabbergasted. And right from the beginning, I went on TV and radio and said the government need to up their thinking to at least to 300 billion, but don't put a limit on it. My philosophy all along was that nobody should be worse off at the end of this pandemic than they were at the beginning. It's still my stance.
Yeah.
And the government have managed to achieve that in lots of cases, but there's people that have fallen through the cracks, and there's millions of them. And those people that have fallen through the cracks are in a devastating mess. And the government do need to look at where those cracks are and look after the people that have fallen through those cracks, because otherwise we're destroying a lot of lives that should not be damaged as a consequence of this pandemic.
Yeah, no, I totally accept that. Do you think, John, that the whole business model now is going to be completely reshaped? It's going to be, bend me, shake me, another way around. People not going back to offices now until March. That's some of the companies in the City of London. I work in the City of London, John. It is like a ghost town even now. I can't believe that the economy is only going to shrink by 11%. There's nobody on the streets. There's no, they're just deserted. It's like Christmas Day every day. I don't know how we can recover from that. And if we do, is it going to be a different business model where people like Amazon are going to take over in delivering goods and put high street shops out of business? And B, will big corporations who have glass palace offices, which are all around me here in London Bridge, are they going to say we don't need them anymore?
Right. Well, I do agree with a lot of what you've just said there, Mike. The only point I would take issue with is I was forecasting 15% drop in GDP. I don't think that's going to happen now. I think it's going to be more like 11, 12. But the V-shaped recovery that the Bank of England announced 2 or 3 months ago, that by the end of next year, we would be back to where we were pre-pandemic. I went on record many times saying that is utter nonsense. And that's to your point, because we are not going to recover to that pre-pandemic level by the end of next year, no matter what we do. So we have to get our fingers out and absolutely build this economy as quickly as we can. To your other point, has the world changed forever?
Yes,
it's already changing on an evolutionary basis. There was already going to be more home working, and there was already going to be a reduction in high street business.
I agree.
But this pandemic has turned what was going to be an evolution that people could try and adjust to into a revolution. And the high street will never be the same again. Office blocks will never be the same again. And once again, I've been campaigning for some time now for the government to look at our high streets and make grants for people to turn retail space into living space and try and breathe some life back into the high street by having the high street being a combination of retail shops and living space and get our city centres lively again.
Okay, so we call that brown site development, would we?
Well, not exactly brown site, because brown site disused spaces outside town centre.
Yeah, but there's going to be a lot of disused offices in a lot of high streets, a lot of disused shops.
Yeah, the principle's that. The principle is exactly that. We take shop units that are never going to be occupied again, and we turn them into some useful function in life that then breathes life back into the high streets and leaves it looking lively rather than like a deserted zone. Yeah, no,
I totally agree. Now, with your business brain on, John, is this actually an opportunity for some smart young person who thinks, I want to get going in life, because he's going to be able to buy assets very cheaply at the moment, isn't he? And then when it does turn round, hopefully it will turn round and everything lifts again, he could find himself in a very beneficial position if he's brave enough now to plunge in there and say, right, it's all cheap, I'm going to get going, sort of thing you might have done when you were a younger man. Well, you might still do it now.
Still, yeah, but no, the problem is that the devastation cannot be put right by an entrepreneur. But just taking another point, every time you get a challenging situation like this, you're absolutely right. It creates massive opportunities for entrepreneurs, brave enough and smart enough to grasp the nettle and do something about it. But in terms of the retail space in the high streets, no, they can't, because that retail space is owned by pension funds and so on. They're used to huge rents, and somebody has to take a massive haircut. The pension funds will have to take a massive haircut, but that affects everybody's pension. But they'll have to, because that high street space is no longer as valuable and will never be as valuable again. What needs to happen is the pension funds do need to take a haircut on this, but also the government needs to put grants in to encourage people to do the right thing, and that is to breathe life back into the high street. It won't be as lucrative what's done, but it needs to happen regardless of the commercial outcome.
Yeah, I understand completely what you're saying. John, as a philanthropist, of course, you're used to giving money away, and that's no secret. That's what you do. To what extent is the government responsible for looking after people in a pandemic which is not their fault?
Do you mean charitable organisations?
No. What I mean is, you're a philanthropist, so you can choose where to put your money whenever you want to, help whoever you want. The government seems to think it's got an obligation to help everybody. One of my criticisms of the government is that Boris Johnson certainly cannot promise people eternal life. But it seems to me like he is trying to sort of say, your life is my responsibility in every way. And I don't think the government need to have got that far into trying to rescue everything, rescue businesses, rescue people's lives, rescue health. I think people have got to stand on their own 2 feet to a greater extent. And I'm not being kind or uncaring, but we all have a personal responsibility, both for ourselves and our family, like, for instance, feeding our children, school dinners. That's been a big debate. And do we want big government to mop up all of that, or do we want to hand it back to the individual for their personal responsibility, which, in my view, has always given us a better chance of success if you've got a personal interest?
Yeah, well, that's a good challenging point, Mike, and I agree with you on half of it and disagree on the other half.
Yep.
The half I agree with, I don't like nanny state. I think there should be more scope during this pandemic for people to make individual decisions. But of course, the problem is with that, if those individual decisions are extremely irresponsible, we spread the virus. Now, I've said from the beginning, what we should do is protect the old and vulnerable and spend billions of pounds, tens of billions, protecting the old and vulnerable.
Yes.
What scientists say is, well, we can try and do that, but we can't do it fully if the pandemic spreads too far, because it will leak into the old and vulnerable and it will take their lives away. And I have a degree of sympathy with that point. So I'm sort of between two stools on this. I do believe that we should have more authority to make sensible decisions, but a lot of people won't make the right decision and will be utterly irresponsible. So that's back to the government being between a rock and a hard place. Regarding the government looking after everybody, it is a government's responsibility to do what's best for society. Sometimes they don't, because they've got one eye on the next election, but I absolutely think that they should be as supportive as they can to every area of business and every individual in a logical, sensible way that preserves the environment that we had before pandemic and leaves us post-pandemic able to come back fighting and protect people's lives. So I do disagree with that point. We need to look after people.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. I mean, the figures show that obviously the most vulnerable are those over a certain age, and they do need looking after. I agree, but it's inevitable that people are going to die. Well, John, look, thanks very much indeed for coming on today. It's fantastic to get the insight into your business brain, how you apply it to society with COVID and how it reacts. And I want to thank you for your time. That's John Caudwell, business leader and philanthropist, better known to many of us as the founder of Phones for You, and a real regular guy, if you don't mind me saying, because, John sounds like a regular guy. He talks like a regular guy, and he's very, very aware of his fellow citizens in this country. That's obvious from what he's just told us here on Talk Radio.